The morning began not with light, but with the rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock that echoed through the vast, hollow spaces of the Vane estate. Silas sat perfectly still in an armchair of butter-soft leather, his spine a rigid line of defiance against the darkness. To the outside world, Silas Vane was a predator in repose. To Silas, he was a mapmaker, constantly charting a territory of shadows. He felt the house before he heard it. A dull thud from the east wing. The heavy oak doors being opened by the domestic staff. A light, skittering vibration through the floorboards, the arrival of the morning mail. His world was a symphony of textures and frequencies. He knew the exact weight of the air when rain was coming, and he could identify his associates by the cadence of their stride long before they spoke a word. This was his ruthless intelligence distilled into its purest form. He didn't need to see the markets to know they were bleeding, just as he didn't need to see his bank ledgers to feel the gravity of his own wealth. Yet, for all his perceived power, the house felt in. He reached out, his hand unerringly finding the handle of the porcelain cup. This was his daily victory, the illusion of total control. He took a sip, the liquid hot and slightly metallic on his tongue, a taste he had grown to associate with the comfort of his condition. He leaned back, his milky eyes fixed on a point 3 inches above where he knew Drusilla stood. He imagined her face, the face of the woman who had nursed his mother, the woman who was the only bridge left to his old neighborhood roots. In a world of corporate sharks, she was his anchor. "The board is restless, Drusilla," he murmured, his voice a low rasp that carried the weight of a command. "They think a man who cannot see the numbers cannot protect the bottom line." "Let them think what they want," she whispered, her hand resting briefly, heavily, on his shoulder. "They don't realize you see more than all of them combined." Silas nodded, a grim smile touching his lips. He believed her. He believed in the vibrations, the smells, and the steady, maternal presence that kept the world at bay. He was a king in a marble cage, unaware that the bars were being reinforced every time he tilted his head back to drink. Simone Reed moved through the Vane estate like a ghost in training, her soft-soled shoes barely making a sound against the polished stone. She had been hired to manage the household's finer details, a nanny for a man who required a different kind of watching, yet she felt more like an intruder in a museum of cold perfections. The air in the mansion was heavy, thick with the scent of lilies and floor wax, and a silence so profound it felt intentional. Her first task of the afternoon was simple. Assist Drusilla with the 3 o'clock refreshment. She found the older woman in the secondary kitchen, a sun-drenched nook tucked away from the main staff hub. Drusilla was a picture of grandmotherly grace, her silver hair pinned back in a soft bun, her floral blouse bright against the sterile stainless steel. But as Simone rounded the corner, she stopped. There was a tension in Drusilla's shoulders that didn't match her humming. Silas was visible through the open double doors of the conservatory, a silhouette of power draped in charcoal wool, his sightless gaze fixed on the gardens. He looked invincible, a statue of a god waiting for a sacrifice. Simone watched as Drusilla reached into the deep pocket of her apron. Her hand emerged clutching a small, unlabeled glass vial. It was unremarkable, filled with a liquid as clear and innocent as the water in the crystal carafe waiting on the counter. With a practiced, surgical flick of the wrist, Drusilla uncorked the vial. One drop fell. Then another. The liquid vanished instantly into the water, leaving no trace, no cloudiness, no warning. Drusilla didn't look up, she didn't check the dosage. She moved with the terrifying muscle memory of someone who had performed this ritual 1,000 times. When she finally looked up and noticed Simone standing in the doorway, her expression didn't crumble. Instead, it smoothed into a mask of maternal concern so seamless it made Simone's skin crawl. "There you are, dear," Drusilla said, her voice like velvet over gravel. "Mr. Vane is particularly thirsty today. The burden of the empire, you understand. It drains a man." She pushed the tray toward Simone, her eyes crinkling in a smile that didn't reach her pupils. "Take it to him. Be careful not to spill. He's very sensitive to the slightest change in his environment. Simone took the tray, her fingers trembling against the cold silver. The crystal glass felt impossibly heavy, a leaden weight of secrets. She looked at the water, sparkling, clear, and utterly lethal, and then at the back of the man who had no idea his sanctuary was a crime scene. As she walked toward him, the vibrations Silas relied on told him someone was approaching, but for the first time, he was blind to the truth of what they were bringing him. The walk from the kitchen to the conservatory felt like a march toward a precipice. The silver tray felt slick in Simone's grip, the crystal glass rattling ever so slightly, a frantic, metallic heartbeat that she feared Silas would hear. He was a man tuned to the frequency of the world, and she was currently a discordant note of pure terror. She caught her reflection in a gilded mirror, wide eyes, pale skin, and the uniform of a servant. Behind her, she felt Drusilla's gaze like a physical weight against her shoulder blades, a silent command to complete the delivery. Silas didn't turn his head as she entered the room, but his nostrils flared. "You're late, Simone. And your pulse is erratic. The floorboards are practically singing with your nerves." I apologize, Mr. Vane," she managed to whisper, her voice caught in the back of her throat. The carafe slipped. I had to start over. This was the moment. As she approached the small mahogany table beside his chair, she noticed a second, identical carafe of fresh spring water sitting on a sideboard, intended for the flower vases. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird in a cage. Silas was reaching out, his long, elegant fingers searching for the glass he expected to be there. In one fluid, terrifying motion, Simone set the tray down on the edge of the sideboard. Her hands shook violently as she gripped the poisoned glass and swapped it for the fresh one. The crystal clinked, a sharp, crystalline chime that sounded like a gunshot in the dead silence of the room. She saw Silas's hand freeze in midair. His milky eyes shifted toward the sound, sightless but terrifyingly focused. "You're clumsy today," he remarked, his voice a cold blade of observation. "I'm sorry," she breathed, her lungs burning as she held her breath. She slid the fresh, untainted glass into the path of his searching fingers. "Here it is, sir." Her eyes darted to the doorway. Drusilla was gone, likely retreated to the kitchen to dispose of the vial. Simone watched, her stomach churning, as Silas's fingers wrapped around the cold condensation of the glass. He brought it to his lips, the light catching the clarity of the water that, for the first time in years, contained nothing but life. He took a long, slow swallow. Simone felt a bead of sweat roll down her spine. She had committed a silent treason against the household's shadows, and as Silas set the glass back down, he tilted his head, a look of fleeting confusion crossing his sharp features. The metallic finish he was used to was missing. The silence in the room suddenly felt less like a tomb and more like a fuse, lit and burning fast. The silence in the conservatory was no longer the heavy, comfortable shroud Silas had lived in for a decade. As the pure spring water settled in his system, a violent, invisible alchemy began to take place. For years, his blood had been a sluggish river of chemical fog, a slow-acting toxin designed to paralyze the delicate pathways between his brain and the world. Now, for the first time, the fog was being flushed by something clean. It started as a dull throb behind his temples, then ignited into a white-hot spike of agony. Silas gasped, his hand flying to his brow, the crystal glass nearly toppling from the table. "Mr. Vane?" Simone's voice came from the periphery, sounding distorted, as if she were speaking through water. He couldn't answer. A sharp rush of heat flooded his chest, radiating upward until his skin felt too tight for his bones. The sensory map he relied on, the vibrations, the scents, the textures, suddenly shattered. The floorboards didn't just vibrate, they screamed. The scent of the lilies in the corner became a cloying, suffocating weight. It was a sensory overload, a neurological mutiny as his nerves, long suppressed into a state of artificial hibernation, began to fire with erratic, desperate energy. Then came the light. It wasn't vision, not yet. It was a brutal, jagged intrusion of gray and gold. For 10 years, the world had been a flat, featureless void. Now, a searing brightness tore through the milky veil of his cataracts, stabbing at his retinas like needles of fire. He groaned, doubled over in his chair, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The blockage wasn't just lifting, it was being torn away. Silas? What is happening? This time the voice was different. It was Drusilla, returning to the room, her tone draped in that familiar, suffocating concern. He felt her hand reach for his shoulder, but the touch, once his only source of comfort, now felt like the sting of a parasite. As the toxin's grip on his optic nerve began to slip, the world flickered. Shadows danced in the periphery of his dead eyes. The heavy, stagnant air of the marble cage seemed to thin, replaced by a cold, terrifying clarity. He realized, with a jolt of pure, calculated rage, that the medical mystery of his blindness had never been a mystery at all. It had been a choice. Someone had been turning the lights out on him, one drop at a time, and for the first time in a decade, Silas Vane felt the first spark of the fire that would burn his kingdom down to find the truth. The pain in his skull receded into a dull, pulsing hum, leaving behind a clarity that felt like a violation. Silas kept his head bowed, his breath hitching in his throat as the world began to bleed through the white curtain. It didn't happen all at once, it arrived in staccato bursts of color and jagged edges. For a decade, he had forgotten the sheer violence of light. He slowly lifted his chin, his milky white eyes still fixed on the empty air, but for the first time in 10 years, the air was no longer empty. The first thing he saw was the texture of the rug, a deep, royal navy that he had only known as a softness beneath his feet. Then, the world sharpened with a cruel, surgical precision. Standing to his left was Dr. Eris, the man he had paid millions to find a cure that never came. Silas's gaze, hidden behind the mask of his unmoving stare, locked onto the gold-rimmed glasses, perched on the doctor's nose. They glinted in the afternoon sun, a symbol of the wealth Eris had extracted from a hopeless case. Silas watched the doctor's lips move, saw the fake lines of concern etched into a face he had previously only known by the scent of peppermint and expensive cologne. Then, the shadow shifted. Drusilla stepped into his narrowing field of vision. The maternal presence he had clung to was suddenly rendered in terrifying detail. He saw the floral blouse, a chaotic pattern of peonies and vines that looked like a tangled garden of secrets. He saw the weathered skin of her hands, the very hands that had guided him, fed him, and poisoned him. Up close, the grandmotherly warmth he had sensed through his skin was a lie, her face was a mask of cold, calculating observation. She wasn't looking at him with love. She was looking at him like a project that was finally nearing its expiration. To his right, a blur of movement caught his eye, a splash of plain, honest fabric. Simone. She stood trembling, her knuckles white as she gripped the back of a chair. She was the only thing in the room that didn't look like a curated lie. Silas felt a rush of adrenaline so potent it turned his blood to ice. He was no longer a blind king, he was a hunter hiding in plain sight. He realized with a predatory thrill that they didn't know. They thought he was still trapped in the marble cage, a prisoner of the dark. He forced his muscles to remain slack, his gaze to remain vacant, even as he memorized the exact shade of the poisoner's blouse and the deceitful glint of the doctor's gold frames. The miracle had arrived, and it had brought with it a cold, calculated hunger for vengeance. To remain the master of this house, Silas had to remain its most helpless inhabitant. He sat perfectly still, his body an anchor of feigned vulnerability, while his mind raced with the electric shock of newfound sight. It was the ultimate performance. He kept his eyelids heavy, his pupils fixed on the middle distance, mimicking the vacant, unfocused, milky white stare that had been his brand for a decade. Inside, however, he was a camera, recording every treacherous detail. Drusilla moved through the room like a ghost, her footsteps light, her presence unburdened by the weight of a guilty conscience. She believed herself invisible. To a blind man, she was a sound and a scent. To the man who could now see, she was a vulture circling a dying lion. Silas watched her through the periphery of his vision, careful not to track her movement with his head. He watched as she glided to the sideboard, her floral blouse blurring into the wallpaper. She reached for the discarded water glass, her fingers lingering on the rim with a proprietary touch, as if checking the progress of her slow-motion execution. "You seem quiet today, Silas," she said, her voice a soft, manipulative coo. She crossed his line of sight, her face coming within inches of his own. He didn't blink. He didn't flinch. He let his eyes remain dead, staring through her as if she were made of glass. He could see the fine lines of greed around her mouth and the way her eyes darted to the safe behind his desk. She wasn't a caregiver, she was a looter in a burning building. "I am merely reflecting, Drusilla," he replied, his voice a steady, practiced monotone. "Reflecting on how much I owe to your constant vigilance." Beside him, he saw Simone's reflection in the window glass. She was watching him, her breath hitched, her eyes wide with a realization that mirrored his own. She knew he had changed. She had seen the way his hand hadn't fumbled for the glass this time. A silent, terrifying pact was forming between them in the reflection of the marble walls. Drusilla chuckled, a dry, papery sound, and began to tidy the room. She moved with a casual arrogance, leaning over his desk to adjust a stack of papers, her back turned to him in a way she never would have dared if she thought he could see. She was a phantom in her own theater, unaware that the audience had finally woken up. Silas felt a cold, predatory satisfaction settle in his chest. He would play the blind man for as long as it took to see every hand that had been shoved into his pockets, and every knife that had been sharpened behind his back. The house settled into the heavy, artificial hush of the evening, a silence that Silas now understood to be a weapon. He waited until the rhythmic click of Drusilla's heels faded down the north corridor, leaving him alone in the study. For the first time in 10 years, he didn't reach for his mahogany cane. He simply stood, his legs steady, and looked at the room as it truly was, a museum of his own stagnation. His target was the wall safe, concealed behind a portrait of his father. Previously, he had operated the dial by the tactile click against his thumb, trusting that the internal contents were exactly where his lawyers said they were. Now, as the door swung open with a heavy, oiled groan, the truth was laid bare under the sharp beam of his desk lamp. He didn't just feel the papers, he read them. His eyes, still stinging from the unaccustomed light, scanned the sensitive documents he had long thought were secure. There, tucked behind a ledger of offshore accounts, was a thick manila envelope that didn't belong. It was filled with wire transfer receipts and correspondence on heavy, cream-colored stationery, the letterhead of Thorne Industries, his primary corporate rival. Silas felt a cold, jagged edge of betrayal slice through his chest. The documents weren't just records, they were a roadmap of his own dismantling. There were signatures in a cramped, familiar hand, Drusilla's. She hadn't just been keeping him docile, she had been a conduit, leaking his proprietary strategies and private access codes to the very people who had been trying to dismantle Vane Global for a decade. She was being paid a king's ransom to ensure the king remained a vegetable while Thorne picked the bones of his empire clean. A floorboard creaked in the hall. Silas didn't panic. He watched the shadow of a pair of feet block the sliver of light beneath the door. It was Drusilla, hovering like a carrion bird, checking to see if her patient was still tucked safely into his darkness. Silas maintained his composure, his gaze locking onto a specific line in a letter: "Progress is steady. The subject remains oblivious. Final neurological collapse expected within the quarter." He quietly slid the envelope back into the safe and clicked the door shut. He sat back in his chair just as the door to the study pushed open. He let his head tilt at that familiar, helpless angle, his milky white eyes staring at a point on the wall while his mind committed every name on those papers to a mental list of the dead. He had seen the trail, now, he was ready to follow it to the end. The air in the conservatory was thick with the scent of rain and treachery. It was the hour of the final dose. Silas sat in his usual chair, his body a masterpiece of feigned stillness, watching the woman he had once called his anchor. Through the thin, lifting veil of his vision, the room was now sharp, colored in the bruised purples of the approaching dusk. Drusilla moved with a frantic, jerky energy that replaced her usual grace. She didn't hum tonight. Her face was a frantic mask of sweat and desperation, her professional composure finally cracking under the weight of the endgame. She reached into her floral pocket and withdrew a vial twice the size of the others. This wasn't a maintenance dose, this was the final neurological collapse promised in the letters. Silas watched her through the shadow of his lashes. He saw her hands tremble as she held the vial over the crystal glass. The glass rattled against the silver tray, a frantic, rhythmic tapping that betrayed her terror. She was a murderer at the finish line, her breath coming in shallow, ragged hitches. She tilted the vial, and Silas watched the heavy, viscous liquid swirl into the water like a predatory ghost. "It's a beautiful evening, isn't it, Drusilla?" The sound of his voice, resonant, clear, and stripped of its usual weary rasp, hit the room like a physical blow. Drusilla froze. The vial slipped from her numb fingers, shattering against the marble floor with a sharp, crystalline spray. "Silas," she stammered, her voice a thin reed. You startled me. You shouldn't speak so suddenly, dear. Your nerves." "My nerves are quite fine," Silas interrupted, his voice dropping to a predatory whisper. He slowly turned his head, the first deliberate movement he had made in years. For the first time in a decade, he didn't stare through her. He stared at her. He watched the blood drain from her face, leaving her sallow and gray in the twilight. He watched her eyes dart to the shattered glass, then back to his, searching for the milky fog that was no longer there. His gaze was a cold, piercing blue, a hunter's gaze that locked onto her with terrifying precision. "That floral blouse doesn't suit you, Drusilla," he said, his lips curling into a smile that carried the promise of a reckoning. "It's much too bright for a woman with such a dark heart. And you're shaking. Is it the guilt, or are you simply upset that you've wasted so much expensive poison?" Drusilla stumbled back, her hand flying to her throat as her maternal mask shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. She saw the man she had tried to bury alive standing up from his throne, his eyes wide open and burning with a light she had spent 10 years trying to extinguish. The cage was open, and the lion was no longer blind. The cleansing of the Vane estate was a silent, surgical affair. As the authorities led a sobbing, broken Drusilla into the night, the heavy silence that had once felt like a tomb transformed into a canvas of possibility. Silas stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his study, his hands clasped behind his back, watching the city lights flicker like a sea of diamonds. For a decade, they had been a myth. Now, they were a target. The reckoning was more than just a legal purge. It was a reclamation. Within 48 hours, the gold-rimmed Dr. Eris had been stripped of his license and his assets, and the executives at Thorn Industries found themselves facing a barrage of litigation that would bury them for a generation. Silas moved through the corridors of his power with a new, terrifying efficiency. He didn't need to feel the vibrations of the floorboards anymore. He saw the flinch in a disloyal employee's eye and the subtle sweat on a liar's brow. His newly awakened eyes were sharper than they had ever been, tempered by a decade of forced introspection. But the most profound change wasn't in the boardroom, it was in the quiet corners of the house. Simone stood by the mahogany desk, her presence no longer invisible, but essential. She had traded her servant's uniform for a suit of sharp, understated charcoal, her posture no longer trembling but braced with the confidence of the only person who had risked everything to see the truth. She was the silent protector who had reached into the dark and pulled a king back to his throne. "The new security detail is in place, Mr. Vane," she said. He walked toward her, his step firm and his vision crystal clear, realizing that the miracle hadn't been the return of his sight, it had been the discovery of an ally he could actually trust. "Thank you, Simone," he murmured, his eyes locking onto hers with a profound, unspoken gratitude. The light in the darkness wasn't just the return of the sun, it was the birth of a new empire built on the wreckage of the old illusion. Silas Vane was no longer a captive of his own wealth or his own vulnerabilities. He walked toward the door, Simone at his side, ready to show the world exactly what happens when a man who has lived in the shadows finally steps into the light.